The halls of the Red Keep felt colder than Winterfell. Ned Stark, Lord of Winterfell and Hand of the King, stood beside the massive, sweat-drenched body of Robert Baratheon. The man who had once been a warrior without equal now lay dying, a weak and broken shadow of himself. The room smelled of wine, blood, and regret. Robert's breaths came shallow. "Ned," he rasped, "promise me, you'll protect the realm, keep Joffrey in line." Ned's jaw tightened. "Robert, Joffrey is not your son." Silence. The words had been spoken and the weight of them hung in the air. Robert's fingers clenched weakly against the bed. "Not my—" His voice failed him. His eyes flickered, searching Ned's face for confirmation, for denial, perhaps even for absolution. But there was none to give. Robert let out a final, shuddering breath. And then the King of the Seven Kingdoms was dead. The room remained still. Ned turned to Ser Barristan Selmy, the last true knight in the Kingsguard. "Summon the council," he ordered. "We must act before the Lannisters do." As the old knight hurried out, Ned knew the war for the throne had just begun. The small council convened within the hour. The moment Robert Baratheon's death was announced, the Red Keep became a viper's nest of whispers and shifting allegiances. Varys, Littlefinger, Grand Maester Pycelle, and Renly Baratheon sat at the table, their expressions unreadable. Cersei Lannister was absent, and that alone put Ned on edge. "The king is dead," Grand Maester Pycelle said solemnly, his wrinkled hands folded over his stomach. "Long live King Joffrey." "No," Ned countered. "Joffrey is not Robert's son." The word sent a ripple of tension through the chamber. Littlefinger smirked as if he had expected it. Renly raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Varys tilted his head, ever the quiet observer. "The Baratheon line must remain unbroken," Ned continued, his voice steady. "The throne belongs to Stannis." Renly scoffed. "Stannis? My brother would be a worse king than the Mad King himself. If the realm must have a Baratheon, let it be me." "This is not a matter of choice," Ned said firmly. "Stannis is the rightful heir." "Then why is he not here?" Littlefinger asked smoothly. "Where is Lord Stannis? Still on Dragonstone, gathering ships? What do you think will happen when the Lannisters hear this claim?" Ned knew exactly what would happen. The Lannisters were already making their move. Suddenly the doors to the chamber burst open, and Ser Barristan Selmy entered, looking grim. "My lord, Queen Cersei has taken Joffrey to the throne room. He is being crowned as we speak." The blood drained from Ned's face. "Then we must act now." Ned entered the throne room with his men, his heart hammering like a war drum. Joffrey sat upon the Iron Throne, his golden hair gleaming in the torchlight. Beside him stood Cersei, her emerald eyes cold and calculating. Eddard Stark had seen many battles, but he had never faced a more dangerous enemy than the woman who stood before him now. "Lord Stark," Cersei said smoothly, "you come before your king. Kneel." "You have no king here," Ned said, his voice like steel. "Joffrey is not Robert's son. He has no claim to the throne." Gasps filled the hall. The tension thickened like a storm ready to break. Joffrey's face twisted in outrage. "How dare you?" "Silence, boy." Ned's patience had run thin. He turned to the assembled lords. "By all the laws of Westeros, the throne belongs to Stannis Baratheon. If you wish to honor Robert's legacy, you will stand with me." For a moment the room wavered on the edge of chaos. Some men murmured, uncertain. But then the Kingsguard shifted, their hands moving to their swords. Littlefinger stepped forward, a half-smile on his lips. "Lord Stark, if you would only see reason." "I see treachery," Ned snapped. Cersei's patience was wearing thin. You were warned not to play the Game of Thrones, Lord Stark, she said softly. Now, you shall lose. At her signal, the Kingsguard drew their swords. Ned's men moved instantly, forming a protective wall around him. But he knew. This was a battle they could not win. Not here. Not now. Fall back, he commanded. We fight another day. As they retreated, he could feel the weight of what had just happened. There would be no peaceful resolution. The war for the Iron Throne had begun. Ned Stark and his men rode hard from the Red Keep to the Stark-held barracks, their breath visible in the cold night air. Behind them, the city hummed with uncertainty. Joffrey might have taken the throne, but the realm was far from united. War was coming, and Ned had to act before the Lannisters solidified their power. Inside the barracks, Ned gathered his most trusted men, Ser Rodrik Castle, Jory Castle, and a few loyal bannermen who had come south with him. Maester Luwin had already sent ravens to Winterfell, but that wasn't enough. They needed allies. Ned turned to one of his men. Get word to Lord Renly. If he wishes to challenge Joffrey, we must speak at once. Renly? Sir Rodrik asked, frowning. He's no rightful king. No, Ned admitted. But he has men, and if we are to survive, we need swords at our backs. Minutes later, Renly arrived, his green cloak billowing as he strode into the chamber. So, Lord Stark, he said with a smirk, have you finally come to see reason? I have come to secure the realm, Ned replied. Joffrey is not the true heir, but neither are you. Renly's smirk faltered. Then who do you support? Stannis, Ned said firmly. Renly let out a bitter laugh. You would name a man who does not even have the loyalty of his own lords? The law is clear, Ned insisted. Renly shook his head. You are too honorable, Stark. Too rigid. Stannis has no charm, no allies, and no chance. Then what would you have? Me do? Support me, Renly said. Together we can take the throne before the Lannisters tighten their grip. Ned's jaw tightened. He had no love for Renly's claim, but he knew one thing. He could not win this war alone. He needed time to think. But time was something he did not have. That night, chaos erupted in King's Landing. Lannister men stormed the Stark-held barracks. They came like shadows in the night, cutting down loyal Stark men before they could even rise from their beds. Jory Cassel fell with a sword through his chest, and Ser Rodrik barely managed to fight his way free. Ned, roused by the sounds of battle, grabbed his sword and rushed into the fray. Blood slicked the floors. His men were dying. Littlefinger's words rang in his mind. You should have taken my offer. This had been a trap. Ned fought his way through the carnage, cutting down Lannister soldiers as he searched for an escape. He found Sir Barristan Selmy holding off 3 men at once, his white cloak stained with blood. My lord, Sir Barristan shouted, we must flee. Ned nodded. There was no victory here. If he stayed, he would die. With the few men who remained, they cut their way to the stables and rode hard into the night, leaving the Red Keep behind them. King's Landing was lost, but the war had only just begun. The cold wind howled as Ned, Stark and his remaining men rode through the narrow winding paths of the Kingswood. The once loyal Stark forces had been butchered in King's Landing, and now with only a handful of survivors, including Sir Barristan Selmy and Ser Rodrik Castle, Ned was a fugitive. His heart ached for his men, for the loyal warriors who had died under the Lannister blades. But there was no time to grieve. He had to reach allies before the Lannisters hunted him down. As dawn broke, They arrived at a hidden camp where Renly Baratheon had gathered his forces. Ned dismounted, his boots sinking into the damp earth as he entered Renly's command tent. Inside, the younger Baratheon stood over a large war map, flanked by his advisors, Sir Loras Tyrell and Lord Bryce Caron. "You look worse than I expected," Renly said with a smirk. Ned ignored the comment. "King's Landing is lost. The Lannisters have taken full control. We must act now." Renly crossed his arms. "And what would you have me do, Stark? March on the city with half-prepared forces?" "Call the banners," Ned said. "Send word to the north, the Riverlands, and the Vale. We take the throne from Joffrey before Tywin Lannister strengthens his grip." Renly exchanged a glance. "With Loras." "You're still thinking like a man of honor, Ned. The throne isn't won by those who wait for the law to side with them. It's won by those who strike first." Ned felt his frustration grow. Renly was charismatic, yes, but he played this game like a child with a sword. He was no Robert. "The North will rise for me," Ned continued, his voice firm. "Robb is already marching with our bannermen." That caught Renly's attention. "And if we join forces? Then the Lannisters will fall." For a long moment, Renly was silent. Then finally, he nodded. "We march at first light, far to the north in Winterfell." Robb Stark stood in the great hall, his hands clenched into fists. The news had reached him. His father was betrayed. The Lannisters held the throne, and war was coming. Robb turned to his mother, Catelyn. "We have to march south." Catelyn's eyes were full of worry. "Robb, this is not just about war. It's about survival. If we go south, we must be ready to face not just the Lannisters, but the game they play." "We don't play games," Robb said. "We win battles." The great John Umber pounded a fist on the table. "The boy's right. The North remembers, and we will not kneel to a Lannister brat." Cheers erupted from the gathered lords. Robb turned to Maester Luwin. "Send ravens to our allies, the Riverlands, the Vale, any who will fight. We march at dawn." The war for the Iron Throne had begun, and House Stark would not be forgotten. The banners of House Stark, their direwolves embroidered in black and white, rippled in the cold northern winds. Thousands of men stood in formation outside Winterfell, their steel gleaming under the pale sun. War drums pounded in the distance, marking the moment Robb Stark would lead his people into battle. At the head of the army, Robb sat astride his great war horse, Grey Wind prowling beside him. His blue eyes, so much like his father's, were hardened with purpose. This was not a march for conquest, it was a march for justice. "The Lannisters betrayed my father," Robb called to his men. "They think the North will kneel." His voice carried over the assembled soldiers, filled with righteous fury. "But the North kneels to no one. We march not for greed but for honor, for vengeance, for Eddard Stark." The army roared in agreement, swords raised to the sky. Beside him, Catelyn Stark watched with a mother's fear. "Robb," she murmured, "are you ready for this?" "I have to be." With that, he turned his horse southward. The North was on the move, and winter was coming for the Lannisters. Far to the south, at the hastily fortified camp of Storm's End, Ned Stark sat at a wooden table, surrounded by banners of multiple houses: House Baratheon, House Tyrell, House Tully, and what few loyalists he had managed to gather. Renly Baratheon paced the tent, restless. "Your son marches south. My army stands ready. Why are we still waiting?" Ned studied the map before him, his mind working through the endless possibilities. War was not won by haste. It was won by careful planning. "Tywin Lannister will not sit idle," he said. "He will send forces to protect King's Landing, but his main strength is still in the west." Sir Barristan Selmy, seated nearby, spoke for the first time. Then we strike before he can consolidate. Ned nodded. Robb will take the Riverlands. We push towards the capital. Renly smirked. And when we take King's Landing, who sits the throne? Ned's jaw tightened. Stannis is the rightful heir. Renly laughed. Stannis is cold and joyless. He has no friends, no charm. Westeros will not rally to him. I do not serve for charm, Ned said, steel in his voice. I serve for justice. Silence filled the room. Finally, Renly sighed. Very well. But if Stannis proves himself unworthy, do not expect me to stand idly by. With that, the decision was made. The war had begun in earnest. The first clash between Starks and Lannisters happened outside River Run. Jaime Lannister, the Kingslayer, himself led a force of 10,000 men against Robb's northern army. It was a battle of strategy versus arrogance. Jaime expected the young wolf to be reckless. Instead, Robb split his forces, leading a smaller army to lure the Kingslayer into an ambush. When the Lannisters charged, they found themselves surrounded. Northmen on one side, Tully archers on the other. Steel met steel. Arrows rained down. Blood soaked the fields. By the time the sun set, Robb Stark stood victorious, and Jaime Lannister was his prisoner. The young wolf had drawn first blood, and the war for the Iron Throne had truly begun. The torches of King's Landing flickered in the cold night air. The city, once bustling with merchants and laughter, was now a fortress of fear. The war had arrived at its doorstep. Inside the Red Keep, Queen Cersei Lannister stood before the Iron Throne, her fingers gripping the armrests as she listened to reports from her commanders. They are coming, Sir Mandon Moore of the Kingsguard said. Stark and Baratheon forces have surrounded the city. Their numbers are greater than ours. Cersei clenched her jaw. And my father? Lord Tywin is marching from the west, but he will not reach us in time. The Queen took a deep breath, steadying herself. She would not fall to the Starks. She would not let Ned Stark rip her son from the throne. Her golden-haired Joffrey sat beside her, restless and fidgeting. We should ride out and crush them, the boy king declared. Cersei turned to him, her voice cold as ice. You will do no such thing. You are not Robert Baratheon. Outside the walls, the banners of House Stark and House Baratheon lined the horizon. Thousands of soldiers had gathered, their torches glowing like a sea of fire. From his command post, Ned Stark watched the city gates, his expression unreadable. Beside him, Renly Baratheon smirked. This is it, Renly said. Shall we see if the lion bleeds? Ned said nothing. His mind was focused on strategy. King's Landing was not just a city, it was a fortress. Assaulting the walls would be costly, but time was on their side. The people will not fight. For Joffrey, Ned said. If we push hard enough, they will turn on him. Sir Barristan Selmy, standing nearby, nodded. The Lannisters rule through fear. If the people believe they can be free, they will rise. Robb Stark, fresh from his victory against Jaime Lannister, rode up to the command post. Father, we are ready. Ned turned to his son, pride and worry flickering in his eyes. Robb had proven himself in battle, but war was far from over. We attack at dawn. As the first light of morning touched the city, the attack began. Northern. Archers unleashed a storm of arrows upon the walls, forcing the Lannister guards to take cover. Baratheon battering rams slammed into the city gates while ladders were raised against the walls. The battle was fierce. Fire and steel clashed as men screamed and fell. Inside the city, panic spread. The small folk, already starving and miserable, under Joffrey's rule, saw their chance. Riots erupted in the streets. The gold cloaks, once loyal to the crown, hesitated. Some turned their swords against the Lannisters. In the chaos, Cersei dragged Joffrey into the throne room. She knew the battle was lost. "Get my son to safety," she ordered Sir Mandon Moore. "Take him to Casterly Rock." But before they could escape, the throne room doors burst open. Ned Stark stepped inside. His sword was drawn, his armor splattered with blood. Behind him stood Robb, Renly, and Ser Barristan. "It's over," Ned said. Cersei's green eyes burned with fury, but she knew the truth. The throne was lost. Joffrey, however, did not understand. "You can't do this, I am the king." Ned stepped forward. "You were never the king." With a nod to his men, Joffrey Baratheon was dragged from the throne, kicking and screaming. The war was not yet over. But for the first time in years, the Iron Throne no longer belonged to the Lannisters, and Eddard Stark had won. The Iron Throne was an ugly thing. Jagged swords melted together in a twisted mass of power and blood. Eddard Stark had seen it many times, but never like this. Never as the man who had won it. The great hall of the Red Keep was filled with banners of the dire wolf and the stag. Soldiers stood at attention, their armor dented from battle, their faces worn with exhaustion. The war for King's Landing had been won, but the war for Westeros was far from over. Robb Stark stood beside his father, his young face hardened beyond his years. Across from them, Renly Baratheon watched with an expectant smirk. "So, Lord Stark," Renly said, "who takes the throne?" The question hung in the air. Ned had fought for justice, not for power. He had sworn to Robert Baratheon that he would protect the realm, and that meant upholding the law. "The throne belongs to Stannis," Ned said firmly. A ripple of tension spread through the room. Renly's smirk faded. "Stannis?" he scoffed. "He didn't fight for this, I did." Ned met his gaze with unwavering resolve. "The law is clear. Stannis is Robert's rightful heir." Renly shook his head. "The law won't win you the loyalty of the realm, Stark. Stannis is not the man to rule. He is cold, rigid, and unloved." "I am not here to debate Stannis's personality," Ned said. "I am here to ensure that justice prevails." Renly took a step forward. "And what if justice plunges the realm into chaos?" Ned's patience thinned. "You swore to fight for what is right." "I swore to fight for a better king," Renly countered. "And Stannis is not it." The room grew quiet. Finally, Renly sighed and turned away. "Do what you must, Stark. But don't expect me to bend the knee." Ned watched him go, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. The war had been won. But Westeros was still divided. Joffrey Baratheon knelt in chains before the throne. His golden hair was matted, his face pale with rage and disbelief. His mother, Cersei Lannister, stood beside him, her wrists bound. "You will regret this, Stark," Cersei spat. "You have no idea what you've done." Ned stared down at them, his expression unreadable. "Your son is no king. His crimes against the realm are unforgivable." Joffrey sneered. "You wouldn't dare kill me. You're too honorable." Ned studied him for a long moment. Then, without a word, he turned to Ser Barristan Selmy. "Take them away." Joffrey's screams echoed through the hall as he was dragged from the room. The young wolf had won the war. But the old wolf knew that. Winning was not the same as ruling, and the hardest choices were still ahead. The Iron Throne was his, but it did not belong to him. Eddard Stark sat in the Red Keep, his eyes weary as he listened to the endless stream of lords, emissaries, and commanders. He had taken King's Landing, deposed the Lannisters, and restored Justice, or so he thought. But the realm was still broken. Westeros was not at peace. Robb Stark stood beside him, his youthful face marked with the burdens of war. "We should have executed Joffrey," he said. "Leaving him alive is dangerous." Ned exhaled slowly. "I will not execute a child, no. Matter his crimes." Robb's jaw tightened. "And what of Cersei? She is still dangerous." Cersei Lannister had been imprisoned, stripped of power but not of influence. Ned knew she was a viper, and yet he had not found it in himself to execute her either. He had wanted to break the cycle of cruelty that defined the Game of Thrones, but mercy in Westeros was often mistaken for weakness. The doors to the throne room burst open. A messenger, breathless and pale, ran forward and knelt. "Your Grace. Urgent. News from the West. Tywin Lannister marches with 20,000 men. He does not recognize your rule." A cold dread filled the room. Tywin Lannister had not died with Joffrey's capture. He was coming to reclaim what was lost. Ned turned to Robb. "Prepare the men." The fields outside King's Landing became a battlefield once more. The banners of House Stark and House Baratheon clashed against the lion sigil of the Lannisters. Robb led the cavalry, his direwolf Grey Wind at his side. Sir Barristan Selmy, too old to be a knight in name, still fought. Like a warrior in his prime. The battle was fierce, steel meeting steel, blood soaking the earth. But the Lannisters had one thing that the Starks did not: ruthlessness. Tywin Lannister did not fight for honor. He fought to win, and he had no mercy to give. As the battle raged, Robb Stark found himself cut off from his men. A Lannister knight slashed at him, and he barely deflected the blow. He fought valiantly, but he was outnumbered. From the hill, Ned saw his son surrounded. His heart clenched. "Robb," he roared. But he was too far. A Lannister spear found its mark. The young wolf fell. Grey Wind howled in fury and pain, leaping onto the attackers with a savagery unmatched. But it was too late. Robb Stark, the hope of the North, lay lifeless on the battlefield. Ned's world shattered. The battle was won. The war was lost. The banners of House Stark still flew over King's Landing. But there was no joy in victory. Robb was dead. And with him, something in Ned had died too. He sat upon the Iron Throne, but it felt colder than the crypts of Winterfell. The realm was still in chaos. The Reach did not recognize his rule. The Lannisters, though defeated, still held sway in the West. Stannis Baratheon, the true heir, had refused to take the throne, retreating to Dragonstone instead. And in the East, whispers of Daenerys Targaryen and her dragons had begun to spread. The cycle would never end. That night, as Ned sat alone in the throne room, the doors creaked open. He turned expecting a guard. Instead it was Lord Peter Baelish. "You look tired, my lord," Littlefinger said, stepping forward. "I am tired," Ned admitted. "This is not the life I wanted." Littlefinger smiled. "That is the truth of power, Lord Stark. It is not something you want. It is something you take." Ned exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Why are you here, Baelish?" Littlefinger leaned in, his voice a whisper. "To tell you what you already know, you have won nothing. The game continues. And you, my dear Ned, are not fit to play it." Ned Stark did not answer, because in his heart he knew it was true. The war did not end. It never did. Winter came. The White Walkers descended upon the wall. The dragons returned. The realm bled again and again, and in the end, it did not matter who had sat the Iron Throne. Because the Game of Thrones had never been about kings. It had always been about who survived, and no one truly did.